All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well. This is obviously the last week of our semester. Um, we will not have class on during finals week, so it's just today and Wednesday. Couple of announcements before we get started with Du Bois. One is that you have a quiz that just opened up today that will be due on the 15th, a week from today. So there is no final exam, but you do have a quiz that covers about the last 4 or 5 weeks of what we've been doing in class. Actually, maybe a little longer. But basically, the quiz covers the writings of Max Weber, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and W.E.B. Du Bois. It's 20 questions, multiple choice and true false questions. Um, and, just like with the other two quizzes, you have a full week to complete it. So you can open up the quiz, take a look at the questions, kind of dig into the material. You can use it as like, an open book, open note kind of quiz, rather than like a pop quiz where you have a more limited amount of time. So that's how I encourage you to approach it, is to look on Canvas to that quiz. In fact, just so there's no confusion, I'll go into screen share mode and show you where it is on your Canvas module. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so if you're looking at my screen now, you should see the modules. There's the writing exercises um, from previously in the semester, and then here you have the quizzes. So quiz number 3 due on December 15th. Um, so the last two assignments that you have due are a perusal assignment having to do with Du Bois, and then this last quiz that sort of substitutes for, like a final exam. Um, and then we have today's class and Wednesday's class. So I hope that that's all clear. If any of those of you who are present with us live have any questions, I'm happy to take them. The other announcement was just a reminder to fill out these evaluation forms and how important those are. We allotted 10 minutes in the last class to doing this, but still less than half of you have responded. So we need to get those numbers up. So please, if you haven't done so already, go here to fill out this feedback on teaching evaluation. Again, it's very important. So I think this is especially important for those of you who are watching the recording of this video lecture. Please do that. Okay, I think that those are all of the announcements. If there are no questions from those of you who are present, we'll get started with Du Bois, our third class on W.E.B. Du Bois. The first two classes, we really focus more on his biographical circumstances, which are very considerable, given that he lived a very long life and he kind of like went back and forth between being a social scientist and then a sort of more of a political activist. He led a varied and complicated life, and so it's important to sort of situate that within his biography. Today, we start, and on Wednesday we look at his key writings. So today we will look at his first book called The Philadelphia Negro, which we've been saying is, a text that Du Bois used social scientific methods to look at the Black community in Philadelphia during the 1890s. And it's really one of the very first works of American sociology, particularly in this tradition of urban sociology, looking at the issues and problems around cities. And and an important sort of documentation of the state of the Black community at that time as well. So this is an important text for a number of reasons. Once we have looked at the Philadelphia Negro, we will look at Du Bois's most famous work, which is called The Souls of Black Folk, which he published in 1903. And this is the text where he introduces his key concepts like double consciousness, the veil, and the color line. So that, as we will see, Souls of Black Folk is a very different text, even though it's only written a few years later. Du Bois writes it in a very different style, with a more emphasis on like music and religion, and he incorporates more, like songs and poetry. He's writing the Souls of Black Folk from a more kind of like spiritual perspective, whereas the Philadelphia Negro he wrote from a much more scientific perspective, where he's trying to document empirically through interviews and surveys. He's trying to use social scientific methods to document the state of the Black community in Philadelphia. So they're two very different texts, but written within just a few years of each other. And so we'll kind of like talk about why it is that Du Bois made this change, this leap in his like style, his writing style, between the two texts, in this period of roughly about 5 years. So with that, I think we could get started. Just looking to see if there are anything. Okay. All right. Let's take a look at the perusal. Taking a while to load here. Hey, come on. Let me go ahead, Paige.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I don't know if you've seen it in the comments. I didn't hear you answer it, but are you okay with us completing it all early? Like, so let's say if I do the reading today and then I do the quiz right after, is that
Oh,
okay with you?
oh, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, you can submit the quiz anytime starting like I think last night at midnight, and then the perusal assignment, of course. Totally.
Okay,
So
cool.
yeah,
I know some professors are kind of like, I want you to take more time on it. But I'm definitely a type I kind of like to get it done early,
yeah,
depending on the class.
I know, yeah.
But
No, it's totally fine.
okay, cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome. I'm gonna have to restart perusal here because I'm having a little bit of it's just going slow, which is a thing that happens sometimes with this. Let's close some of these things out. There we go. Okay. Okay. So I think we covered the uh, intellectual biography and core concepts and his theoretical orientation. I think we covered those pretty thoroughly last week. That means that we can get into this text um, that was, like I said, the sort of like the first real like scientific sociological work that was done in the United States, the Philadelphia Negro. And so basically, the introduction here from the editors gives you a bit of the context for this. And what stands out to me, first and foremost, is just what a huge study this was. Where it says here in the third sentence, Du Bois carried out 5,000 surveys and interviews with African Americans in the Seventh Ward. I believe that he had some assistants to help with that. It's hard for me to imagine somebody doing that much on their own. But even so, we're talking about as it says here, a neighborhood that had about maybe 10,000 Black people living in it to begin with. And so if you like surveyed and interviewed like half of them, that's a very high sample percentage, what, social scientists refer to, samples in terms of like you can't expect reasonably to interview and ask everybody. So you get, a certain small percentage of the population to respond or, to ask a poll question to. And then you can kind of like, generalize about the population as long as you have a random sample or a representative sample that you're confident about generalizing about. That's how like political polling, for example, works. When they're estimating the polls based on a small percentage of the overall population. But Du Bois, it seems like maybe interviewed like half the people in his neighborhood, or did at least a survey with like half the people. That's pretty enormous and very thorough. And probably in today's day and age, you wouldn't, with the advent of sampling and things that I imagine were not very well developed in Du Bois's time, you just wouldn't do that. You just wouldn't need to. You could interview or survey a much smaller number of people and then sort of generalize from the results. But it wasn't only that they were doing. They were also, as it says, like doing a sort of an ethnographic participant observation study as well. It talks about like Du Bois and his wife Nina also directly experienced many of the conditions he described so vividly while living in the settlement house in the heart of the Seventh Ward. So they're living, in this neighborhood, and in this settlement house. And so, he did this sort of ethnographic research and then also historical research. So the scale of this today, we would call it a multi-methods or a mixed methods form of social research in which you bring together statistics with ethnographic description along with historical context. It's an immense, undertaking. And it may help to know that how this study came about was with the University of Pennsylvania. So Du Bois was hired by Penn, as it's popularly known, the University of Pennsylvania, which is in Philadelphia. It's an Ivy League college, very prestigious. They hired Du Bois. They wouldn't allow him to teach, um, but he was able to he was hired to conduct research on the Black community in Philadelphia by this Ivy League institution, and so that's where the sort of the money and the resources and the ability to conduct the study came from. So that may sort of help to understand how it is that he was able to conduct such a massive study. Is that he had resources that were basically at his disposal from from Penn. Um, so you the sort of the editors here describe all the various things that Du Bois was interested in trying to document. So it explains people's lives. They say here in rich historical, statistical, and ethnographic data, chapter by chapter. Du Bois systematically outlines relevant information, relevant demographic and other information about the Black population, including the size, age, and sex of the Negro population, family, marriage, education, and illiteracy, housing, occupations, and institutions, and most importantly, the Black church. So Du Bois is trying to basically like document statistically and ethnographically a whole range of social practices and institutions within the Black community around these issues, family and marriage, education and illiteracy, housing, the job market, and especially as it says, the Black church, because the church historically had been really the center of Black life in America, particularly in the South, but also in northern cities like Philadelphia. The church was kind of like the one place where Black people could safely congregate, particularly in under the conditions of slavery in the South. This was certainly the case. That if Black people were associating in some way, outside the church, it was considered like dangerous. It was considered like potential for an insurrection or a rebellion. So the church was like the it was like the sanctuary. It was the place that people had to go. And so it was where, not just a place of worship, but a place of community, a place where people shared information, a place where people, networked socially. The church, as Du Bois will document, was also a place where Black music really, really thrived and was allowed to, continue in this sort of like religious way with like gospel and things of that matter. So the church had this really important social function in Black life, and like still does. But at that time was really a central institution because all of these other forms of institutions and social life had been really marginalized or completely like outlawed. Schools, even sort of like collective institutions or community institutions, community organizations. Everything that the church was kind of the center of everything. So this is what Du Bois is interested in trying to sort of document at that time in the Seventh Ward. He also kind of looked at some of the problems, what we would today call like the social problems of urban life. So poverty, low wage work, um, insufficient housing, like substandard housing, And then all of the sort of symptoms sociologically that come with, you know, poverty and low wage work and stuff. So you have, pauperism, alcoholism, criminality, all of these sorts of like symptoms that you see in all sorts of communities and neighborhoods which are, characterized by poverty and inequality. You see this in, it's sort of like sociologically all over the world. So Du Bois maintained a multidimensional theoretical orientation, as it says here. And one thing that he documented was that the Black community in Philadelphia was not a singular homogenous entity. It was not a single thing, but rather a community that was stratified into different classes or different like social layers. And he describes these four economic classes here within the Philadelphia Black community. So you had, the sort of more well-to-do, I imagine, doctors and lawyers and maybe like small businessmen, those sorts of people. Then you had the decent hard workers, maybe like craftsmen or artisans or, people with more like steady work. Then the third, the worthy poor who were barely making ends meet. And then finally, the submerged tenth, who were beneath the level of socioeconomic viability. So people in more extreme conditions of poverty and perhaps, homelessness or something to that effect. So he sort of, understood the Black community as not a singular, homogenous thing, but something that was stratified into these various layers. He also understood, um, and this was Du Bois was really ahead of his time in documenting this. What he called a colortocracy, or what today people would call like colorism, the way that like lighter skin is rewarded and upheld. Some might even say fetishized within not just the Black community, but in all sorts of communities of people of color, where variations on lighter skin is comes with more privilege or perhaps more like opportunity or status, ways in all kinds of ways in which like colorism acts within communities of people of color, and conversely, that darker skin, is more sort of like looked down upon or, perhaps thought of as like not as beautiful, or, is generally a kind of a sign of a lower class or status within a group. So this thing about colortocracy, or what we would today call like colorism. Um, so Du Bois depicts this in saying, light skinned blacks were a caste apart and formed the bulk of Du Bois's talented tenth. So Du Bois had this idea about the talented tenth as like, the most educated people within the Black community, presumably like himself, who would be leaders and who, could, even though they were 10% of the population, they were only 10% of the population, they could play a leading role in progress towards civil rights and equality. Du Bois believed that you had to have that talented tenth had to be, working on behalf of the other 90% of the community, to, better the entire community, to sort of uplift them with them. And I don't think Du Bois ever said this directly, but it's clear that Du Bois imagines himself in that kind of role, as an educator and as a political leader, as a writer, as somebody who plays a leading role as part of the so-called talented 10th in uplifting the community and the other 90% of the population. So this colortocracy, as it says here, reflects the non-rational realm at the collective level in the sense that it represents a symbolic code or scheme in Durkheimian terms, a status system based on group membership in Weber's terms, and an ideology in Marxist terms. Du Bois himself wrote, individual members of the colortocracy at times developed a notorious but distinctive racial complex involving an ideology that set them apart from those they viewed as their inferiors. They would take excessive pride in their so-called white features, including light skin, thin noses and lips, and good hair. Often color struck, they mimicked and voiced the anti Black prejudices of whites whose fears, concerns, and values they understood and partly shared. Um, I don't remember if it was here or in another discussion, but Jill had brought up a really good movie, about this sort of thing called Sorry to Bother You, that was made by the directed by the activist and musician from Oakland named Boots Riley, who was in a rap group called The Coup, and now is a filmmaker and a TV show, like producer. And so he made this movie called Sorry to Bother You, where I think that the plot is like a black guy that goes to work for like a telemarketing, kind of thing, where he's calling people on the phone, and he's somehow able to manage to make his voice sound, white, like, the most like kind of generic nerdy, kind of white accent. And so I think it's Lakeith Stanfield who plays the actor, who was in the show Atlanta and other things, and so it's there's a real like disconnect between seeing Lakeith Stanfield and then hearing this sort of white tone voice.
I
But
think in the film he is um told to use his white voice. I
yeah,
think
okay,
there's
so
like a
that's it.
somebody else who is like upper like in the upper stories of the building or whatever who has been promoted said, you got to use your white voice. And he was like, what?
Yeah, and then doesn't he becomes like super successful and like
Yeah.
moves
Yeah. He
into
becomes
like
VIP and is treated all this different way. And then the end gets kind of crazy.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a very like surreal comedy, right? Like it's a kind of it's
It's
very,
dark humor for sure.
yeah, and it's really like exaggerated, um, hyperbolic, and so it's supposed to be read as a kind of a social satire, but it's this satire of basically like class and race in America, and how they're kind of intertwined. And this is something that Boots Riley himself has been commenting on in various ways, like since the 90s. I mean, this is a guy that like collaborated with like Tupac, like Boots, does has some really interesting social commentary. If you aren't aware of his work, I'm trying to think of the other things that he's done. He had that show about the kid who was like a giant, and I just can't remember the name of the show right now. But that was great. He does a lot of like social satire in a way that's very surreal and over the top, and makes a statement through exaggeration. Um, anyway, I very much um, recommend the work of Boots Riley for this sort of thing. So that this is what is being talked about here in terms of like colorism, and the sort of like the privileges that go with it, the colortocracy. And I don't know that anybody had really sort of commented on this before if Du Bois did in 1899. If there is, then uh, I don't know about it. So, from the scope of the study, now to sort of like go into the text, it gives us a little bit of like background in terms of like how the study kind of took place in the Seventh Ward of Philadelphia, starting in 1896 and going through 1897. And he sort of describes this part of the population, and where the scope of this research is. So just remember to go back a lecture or two. Remember that Du Bois goes off to Germany in the 1890s, and that's where he learns all of these like social scientific methods, the surveys and interviews, and the way he kind of like maps out the city, and comes to understand this whole community. All of these are using methods that he has brought back with him from Germany. So, he goes off to Berlin, I think in 1892, and he absorbs all this stuff that's going on with like German sociology, this kind of circle of German intellectuals around Max Weber, people that are really developing social scientific methods. And then Du Bois is like, okay, I'm going to take these tools, these methods, bring them back with me to America, because he believes that good sociology can combat racism, because he believes that like good sociology will show people the truth, that like racism isn't real, or these racial differences that people think are natural or biological are actually not real, that they're socially constructed and so forth. Du Bois has this real hope that sociology and social scientific methods are going to be a weapon of progress, that they're going to be something that will help change the society for the better. And so that's his motivation for doing this study of the Black community in Philadelphia, is has this kind of like this urgency about it, because he wants to use methods for this larger social purpose. And so then he goes and talks about the problems, the scope of the problem here. He says in Philadelphia, as elsewhere in the United States, the existence of certain peculiar social problems affecting the Negro people are plainly manifest. Here is a group of people, perhaps 45,000, a city within a city, who do not form an integrated part of the larger social group. This is in itself is not altogether unusual. There are other unassimilated groups, Jews, Italians, even Americans, and yet in the case of the Negroes, the segregation is more conspicuous, more patent to the eye, and so intertwined with a long historical evolution, with peculiarly pressing social problems of poverty, ignorance, crime, and labor, that the Negro problem far surpasses in scientific interest and social gravity most of the other race or class questions. So what basically Du Bois is saying here is he's like, hey, like black people are not the only people that are being discriminated against and who are being segregated and who are being, exploited in the workplace and so forth. Like Jews, Italians, Irish, all these other groups are also getting the short end of the stick. But none of them are in as bad of a condition as the black population finds itself. All of those things that are used to discriminate against, Jews, Italians, and the Irish are used with much greater force and more severe impact on the black community than they are on these like European ethnic groups. That's essentially like what I kind of read that to be saying is all these things are the scope of anti-black racism is much more severe, and the extent of racial segregation compared to like ethnic segregation is much stronger. So there's something different about anti-black racism that is much stronger than say like other forms of like ethnic discrimination against like different immigrant groups or different ethnic groups that have European origins. So I think that that's sort of like you know where he kind of concludes about the state of the black community. So then he gives us basically like a set of questions that he's sort of like wants to investigate as part of the scope of this problem, and you can see that he's taking a more kind of like interpretive approach. This is the sort of thing that Max Weber advocated with his Verstehen, his concept of interpretive understanding. That sociologists, in other words, the task of the sociologist is kind of like to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. That old expression that's kind of like about empathy or something. You try to understand the world through the eyes of the people that you're studying. You try to see how the world looks to them. You try to interpret and understand their condition from their own perspective. This was something that Max Weber very much believed in, and again, something that Du Bois took home with him from Germany and then tried to, apply it in this study. So these kinds of questions, like to notice, all of these things around um, the environment, the physical environment of the city, the sections and houses, the far mightier social environment, the surrounding world of custom, wish, whim, and thought, which envelops this group and powerfully influences its social development. So he's not just like counting things like how many people have jobs and how many people are married and all this kind of thing. He's also interested in understanding and interpreting how the how the world looks from the perspective of these people. Um, so so here is where Du Bois goes a little bit more in these two paragraphs. He's starting to present some of his conclusions or like his findings, basically around like these social problems, like crime and poverty and unemployment, the character of like slum housing in the city. He's basically drawing out some of his findings of his study here And then he goes in these paragraphs, basically for the rest of this section, he's going to talk about the four main classes within Philadelphia's Black community. And here he adds to that discussion like an analysis of how these four different groups are like clustered into different neighborhoods within the city. So there's this like residential segregation within the Black community of the classes. So, like he says, like the problems of the 13th ward differed from the problems of the 5th as the Black inhabitants differ. In the former ward, we have represented the rank and file of Negro working people, laborers and servants, porters and waiters. This is at present the great middle class of Negroes feeding the slums on the one hand and the upper class on the other. And then they proceed to sort of discuss, starting with the more upper classes, and then moving down into those who are in more extreme conditions of poverty. Here is where he talks about this thing about colorism in a bit more depth around this idea of like color prejudice or the colortocracy, as I mentioned it. And then there's a long kind of list here in which Du Bois is basically describing all of the various ways that race and like racial prejudice, racism impacts the Black community with respect to all of these different dimensions of social life. So he starts at, the first two are about work, about um, getting to work and keeping work, the sort of like job discrimination and, kind of like inequalities of job opportunities. That continues on, to this thing about getting new lines of work, like being able to move up and be promoted, or the chances of upward mobility.
Was Professor,
Yo,
was that Du Bois that was that? Because I'm thinking of something along the lines of what you were saying, how um for instance, like a black woman have it harder than, a white woman, a white man, or a black man. But at
mhm.
the same time, the black man can work at the same company that the black woman could not potentially get into, but they will stay at this like bare minimum position, never being allowed to elevate to a more prominent position, right? That's what you're getting at?
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, I don't think Du Bois was the only person to really notice that, but he's certainly talking about that here. And then the common expression, I think it developed a little bit more in the 20th century, but Du Bois is basically getting at it here. The expression is that Black people were always the last hired and the first fired. Uh,
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like what he's getting into, like at this third point with like entering new lines of work, this kind of thing, is
Hmm.
like, because of like seniority stuff. If you're the last hired, you're going to be the first fired, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think it's kind of along those sorts of lines. He's,
Yeah, just to emphasize that, because I understand that, but I think that that would apply to like, I don't think that that's segregated strictly to race. Like, I think
right.
so in today's work world, I understand, the invisible lines and the inequalities within the workplaces, but um, the last first, which, how did you say it? The last hired is the first fired. I think that
Yeah.
that's for all jobs, no matter your race, because I mean, if somebody needs something to pawn something off on, they're always going to find that last person that could take the fall.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and yet it's kind of like what Du Bois is saying is that Black people would be systematically discriminated against to the point where they'd be the last people hired, right? So, like, the
Mhm.
employer would have preference for, Irish or Italian or, other like ethnic, people of European descent who were immigrants. And so therefore, like when, because people were the last hired,
Mhm.
they would be the first fired in, like a recession or a depression or something like that.
Oh, okay, okay. I'm sorry. My brain, I don't feel well. My brain's all foggy. Sorry. Thank
You're
you.
good. You're good. Yeah, I mean, I think you have it right. Um, and he's just saying like, yeah, it does apply in all sorts of different conditions. I mean, you have to think too, like the kinds of jobs that were available and that people were competing for were much different then than they are now. I mean, now we have an economy that's much more oriented around service work, and then in 1899, it was an economy much more oriented around manufacturing work. So Black people and Black men in particular were, trying to get jobs in factories and mills and warehouses and those kinds of work environments. That's where, the better money was, for like, kind of more like industrial labor. And they're sort of systematically discriminated against then. Um, Now in service work, it's like there's I think in a lot of ways a preference to hire women, for those kinds of positions. Is just the sense that women are better or like better socialized into, like customer service kinds of jobs or personal service kinds of jobs. That those kinds of things don't aren't like a very good fit for the way that most men are socialized into their masculinity. So it's a totally different work environment, you know. Um, but yeah, thanks for the question. Um,
Yeah, for sure. And you were talking about labor and stuff like that, but what I can't think of my brain, I'm telling you, is like all mushy. The there was the what are them people that they're like private, they work at they work at like all kind of companies, but they have like this private organization that protects them.
like a union?
Union, yes,
Yeah,
yes, thank you.
yeah.
Okay, so with that, did union laws, how old is the union law, and did that cover the African American potentially better positioning him to obtain and sustain employment, or is that like two totally different topics and my brain's just crazy right now?
No, this is a very important question, Precious,
Okay.
about the relationship between unions and Black workers. The first like real unions, for working people, you start to see them in like the 1830s and 1840s. So going back before the Civil War. Um, the real height of the union membership would be, probably in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. That's when union membership was very high, and that's when working class people experienced the largest wage increases that they've ever seen in this country. This was a period, between, especially like after the Great Depression and then, after World War II, where working people had more income and, opportunity than they've probably ever had since. You could, buy a house in the suburbs. You could send your kids to college. You could take a family vacation, even if you were like an auto worker or a, steel worker or something like that. Um, the relationship between unions and the black community and black workers is really complicated because a lot of those unions discriminated, against black workers, especially, not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but a lot of them did discriminate, and so black workers didn't experience the same kind of like wage growth and increasing, income and upward mobility that white workers did, especially like say auto workers or steel workers. So it's a really complicated question. It's hard to answer in general terms because it's like, not all the unions were discriminated in that way, but a lot of them did. And so black workers didn't experience the same kinds of increases, nor, did like Latino workers, especially people who were like farm workers, were, if they tried to form a union, they were um, repressed and often, violently beaten. This is what happened, with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers during the 1960s when they tried to unionize farm labor in California. So there's, it's, I guess the short answer is that it's been harder for people of color, workers who are people of color to enjoy the same benefits that unions have brought, um, both because the unions have tended to, in many cases, be discriminatory, and also because there's been so much repression and violence against people of color when they have tried to unionize, like with the United Farm Workers. And so that's a big reason why we still have this huge divide within the working class in America across lines of race. Why white workers have historically had it a lot better than black or Latino workers. I don't know if that totally it really answers your question, but it's a complicated and a very important one that you posed, Precious.
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much. And it also expands my understanding of the boys because sometimes I can get confused in his readings.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Um, he's a very important thinker, and he kind of goes he touches on a lot of different things. Um, so hopefully I can help you keep, kind of keep that all together. So, the Philadelphia Negro, you know, kind of comes in here, to sort of a conclusion here. Du Bois is talking about, in this conclusion about, racial prejudice and the significance of racial prejudice in causing these problems, and sort of like the meaning of all of this, and sort of like what is to be done about this. I'd like to spend the last few minutes just at least introducing the souls of Black folks so that we can come to it um, on Wednesday. Sure why it's not loading the rest of it. Um, in introducing this book, there's just a couple of things that I want to highlight here at the end so that we can start with them fresh on Wednesday, with like having highlighted these key aspects of the text that we can sort of pick up from. Okay, so one of them is this first point that's made about his argument with Booker T. Washington. So, The Souls of Black Folk comes out in 1903. It's just a few years after the work on Philadelphia. But it's written in the middle of a really intense debate among Black intellectuals, like Du Bois. And there's this debate that's basically about like education, it's about politics, it's about economics, it's a very, sort of wide ranging disagreement with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is, at this point, is probably the most famous Black person in America at that time. Considered to be a leader, but in a much more kind of like moderate kind of way. Like he's somebody who's considered to be a gradualist when it came to civil rights, somebody that didn't, rock the boat too much, wasn't an extremist or a radical or anything of this matter. Booker T. Washington was, like highly respected, and Du Bois criticized him pretty mercilessly, as we will see in The Souls of Black Folk. It said, so the editors write here, The Souls of Black Folk is important because it explicitly exposed an important intellectual and political schism in the Black community between the more moderate Booker T. Washington and the more radical Du Bois, as well as radical political activists such as the journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett, a feminist and anti-lynching activist. In his essay of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, Du Bois pointedly attacks Washington for his capitulating agenda. Basically, Du Bois, in so many terms, Du Bois called Washington a sellout, somebody who had sold out the Black community to kind of like enhance his own leadership and his own agenda. Du Bois was enraged by Washington's Atlanta Compromise, favored by many whites, in which Blacks would disavow open agitation in exchange for developing their own segregated institutions, which Du Bois interpreted as nothing more than the old attitude of adjustment and submission. Du Bois also abhorred Washington's gradualist solution to the issue of suffrage and his notion that Negro education should primarily be in the form of trade schools rather than abstract knowledge. So the Atlantic Compromise was this kind of thing that brought together Washington and some other Black leaders, a lot of people associated with the Black church, together with like white industrialists and white political leaders. And, the as the term compromise kind of suggests, it basically laid out in an agenda in which Black people could kind of go along with Jim Crow segregation in developing their own segregated institutions that were separate from white society, and that uh, there wouldn't be a kind of agitation for equality. In other words, there wouldn't be a kind of an agitation for full acceptance and integration into the society. The Atlanta Compromise was very much about like Black Southerners accepting a kind of subordinate and segregated position within the South. And Du Bois thought this was just terrible. Um, and, it was done under this premise from Washington, Booker T. Washington, that he was a gradualist, that he favored a slow march of progress, as opposed to making extreme demands. And Du Bois is, I think, definitely has a point here when he says, like, you know people who preach gradualism and slow progress, like, it just never happens. It just is always an excuse kind of for ultimately for doing nothing. And so Du Bois, thought in no uncertain terms that Washington was a kind of a sellout. Um, and this is really apparent in their argument about education, which I kind of pointed out a little bit last time, and we'll have to come back to again on Wednesday. But Washington and Du Bois had these very different ideas about what the purpose of education was within the Black community. Remember, I said that, like, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, there's this thirst for knowledge, because the enslaved people had been kept deliberately illiterate and, without even the most basic educational skills. And so, therefore, when the Civil War comes to an end and the slaves are emancipated, there's all these schools that end up getting built, all across the South, K through 12 schools, but also, like, Black colleges and universities. Du Bois ends up attending one of those that was founded in 1868, called Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. So there's this real question about education within the Black community, and, like, kind of like, what is the purpose of it? Um, Booker T. Washington advocated for something that was more like a strictly vocational kind of training. He called it industrial education. And so the idea was basically that Black people would learn, but only so that they could be better workers, that they could learn, to be maybe a better farmer, or they could learn a trade, a skill that would be useful in the workplace. But they wouldn't learn about, like, history and philosophy and art and, poetry and, stuff like that. Like the liberal arts would be off limits. Booker T. Washington was like, yeah, people, Black people don't really need to learn that stuff. They should just, like, focus on being, more valuable workers. And of course, like, the white industrial class, they loved hearing that. They loved, the idea that these people would go to school so that they got they could be more valuable workers, but they wouldn't, learn things that might make them more, like, rebellious or make them question the society. They wouldn't, in the parlance of our times, they wouldn't be woke. They wouldn't go to school to get woke. They would learn. They would go to school to learn a job. And Du Bois was more of the, as we've seen, Du Bois as somebody who was, um, fully committed to education, and from a very young age, immersed himself in all sorts of subjects. Du Bois thought this was terrible. Washington's idea to limit education to industrial education. Du Bois thought that everybody should be learning art, philosophy, history, writing, just the general liberal arts curriculum should be something that everyone, no matter what their background, should have access to. And at the time, it was just like, you had to be like an elite, you had to be of the upper classes. So the upper classes, they'd go off to Harvard, and they'd study, Beethoven, and they'd study the Hegelian philosophy, and they'd study Latin, and they'd study art history, and they'd study all this stuff. So if it was good enough for them, why shouldn't everybody have access to that kind of education and knowledge? That was Du Bois's perspective. Du Bois really thought that education should be more these kinds of abstract knowledge, in the sense that it's not knowledge that's like directly useful in helping you be a better worker, but it's knowledge that's useful in making you a better person, or a more enlightened person, a better citizen, a better, participant in your community, those kinds of skills, and not just like narrow job training. So that's one sort of crux of their argument, but it's a very all-encompassing debate between Du Bois and Washington. The other key point about the Souls of Black Folk, and its significance, is in the way that Du Bois will write from a different kind of voice. So this is how I kind of started with today's class. Du Bois really shifted his writing voice to emphasize a more spiritual and soulful prose. He draws on music. We'll see that at the beginning of every chapter of this book. He starts with a song, the so-called sorrow songs that emerged out of the Black church, the songs that were kind of like predecessors of like spirituals, and then like the blues basically comes out of these sorrow songs, that have their roots in the Black church. Du Bois incorporates this into his text, and so it's a real 180-degree turn from where he had been in the Philadelphia Negro when writing that book just a few years ago. He took a much more scientific, empirical approach. He wanted to use these scientific methods to document this community. And so his voice was much more like detached, objective, neutral. Whereas in the Souls of Black Folk, his voice is much more passionate. It's much more spiritual. It's much more lively. And so, whereas the Philadelphia Negro is a great work of social scientific methodology, the Souls of Black Folk is a great work of prose, just a great work of writing. He also draws on his own autobiographical experiences, as we'll see. It's quite remarkable that someone could kind of, today they would say, like, code switch between like this more scientific objective style into a more kind of like soulful spiritual kind of style. And the reason for this, as we will see, is that, as it is explained here, that Du Bois had become convinced that logical, scientifically grounded arguments alone would never convince white Americans of the true workings of racial discrimination and prejudice. As a result, he turned away from the more empirical, scientific accounting of race after writing The Philadelphia Negro, convinced that facts alone did nothing to motivate people toward improving conditions for blacks. He began to write with a more soulful voice because, quite rightly in our view, he recognized that race does not work or exist solely at the rational level. So he realized the limits of how science can be used to combat racism. Racism is something that is not logical, it is not rational. And so it's really hard to convince people on the basis of scientific, rational arguments, because people believe when it comes to racism, people believe all kinds of like crazy, frankly, stuff that it's hard to talk them out of. If you've ever gotten into like a Facebook argument with somebody, the facts and that stuff just goes out the window, and people believe all kinds of superstitious, irrational kinds of things. And so Du Bois realized that like science could only take you so far in that kind of environment, that he needed to have another kind of argumentation. He needed to have another kind of voice to meet people with. That to me is the remarkable shift that happens in Du Bois's work within a short period of time, and the fact that he was able to sort of code switch like that, I think is absolutely remarkable, and something the likes of which I had never seen before. All right. That is just about all we have for today. So then we'll pick up next time with the souls of Black folk, and then another work called the souls of white folk. And that'll be our last class for the semester. I wish you all a good day, and I will see you on Wednesday. Thank you.